Welcome to our presentation that we're calling Things You Should Never Hear in an ARD Meeting. We unfortunately have heard some of these things. Taken this presentation largely and adapted it from a talk that was given at one of our special ed conferences by a couple of attorneys, and thought it was good enough and laughed enough or cringed enough that we thought it was worthwhile spreading to us, the rest of the district here in Denton ISD. Of course, we don't want to hear these things in an ARD meeting, but we definitely don't want to say them. And for goodness sake, we don't want to write them down somewhere like in an ARD deliberations or a minutes page, something like that. Our first and sometimes most common thing that we see is we don't have the money for that. There's no funding for that. I don't know where we're going to get the resources for that is basically what it boils down to. And I want to stop for a minute before anything else and remind what that parent might be hearing when they hear this. What they don't hear is we don't have the money for that. What they are hearing is that we've got money for other stuff, just not for this because your child isn't worth it. Now, the law is very, very clear. Cost and convenience are not a good reason to reject a request. What you want to do is you want to focus on why the service or a device or an accommodation or anything is needed for a special education student. What's the function behind the service? And what's the least restrictive way that we can provide that? Yes, equine therapy might calm a child down, but is taking him off the campus and transporting him to a horse ranch and getting him strapped up and having him ride for half an hour, is that really the best way to provide some comfort to that child when it could be a cooling down mat in the middle of the classroom, or I mean off in a corner classroom or something like that? Just an example of how that process might look at. So you want to pick what's appropriate and what's necessary for that child to receive educational benefit in the classroom, and then pick from those options. Data. Always document the educational need for any request that is made by the parent or the teachers or any other member of the ARD committee. That's not fair. What about the other 22 or 25 or 16 children in the classroom? We hear this, of course, a lot from gen ed teachers who are less familiar with the special ed process and the principles behind that. So IDEA, our law that governs special education, it wasn't designed to be fair for the whole student population. It was designed to address the unique needs for students who have disabilities, and it was made to protect the rights of those students. So the parent, I'm sure, is sitting there thinking, well, it's not fair that my child was born with a disability, and when, at the end of the day, we have to follow the law, even if it's not fair. What IEP? Nobody ever told me he had an IEP. This was probably the most cringeworthy thing that I heard in an ARD meeting. And we start digging around and we find that usually what has happened is somebody hasn't reviewed paperwork and made sure that a student is getting everything that they were ARDed to get. So I encourage you to set up programs or ways, mechanisms in your schools where you spend some time at the beginning of the year and teachers have time there when a student enrolls to make sure that you confirm that everybody knows what services those students are getting. IEP plans and 504 plans, they get more and more difficult as students get older, simply because you have more teachers involved and everybody has trouble getting on the same page sometimes. We do see sometimes, we'll be in an ARD meeting and the parent will want to know, oh, well, how's my child doing in math, or how's he doing in English? And that teacher isn't present at the ARD meeting. So it's time to get up and go get that math or that English or that history teacher if they haven't had a chance to give you input before the ARD. Getting everybody's input before the ARD, setting up those mechanisms like a teacher input form that everybody contributes to, those can go a long way to having a smooth IEP meeting where you have all the information there at your fingertips. Students with emotional disturbance can be a challenging group of students, mostly because behaviors tend to be more concerning to educators than academic deficits do. The student who has an explosive behavior or a non-compliant behavior can be more of a challenge, an immediate challenge, than the student who's having trouble progressing on their math or their reading goals. But if their programs are planned and implemented properly, it's important for us to understand and really get our heads around that all students can achieve success, whether it's in academic or behavioral places. If they're not progressing in IEPs, then those IEPs probably need to be adjusted. But at the end of the day, it is important for everybody in that ARD committee in that school to appreciate the fact that emotional disturbance is a disability, the same as a learning disability is. And sometimes students with disabilities take a long time to gain skills that they have challenges with, just like the student who is having a challenging time learning to decode CVC words. It can take a student with an emotional disturbance disability, a behavioral disability, an extended period of time to learn some of those skills that make them successful in a functional behavioral type of realm. We already decided that in the staffing. Now we're allowed to have staffings. We're allowed to have conferences amongst school personnel to come up with draft ideas and come up with a plan that we reasonably expect to benefit the student. The key here is that we have to come with an open mind to other alternatives. We can't, the term that we use here is predetermination. We can't predetermine the outcome of an ARD meeting because that parent has to have participation in that process. It has to be a collaborative effort between the school and the parent to meet the needs of the student. We have to make sure that we don't come into an ARD meeting and decide preemptively that a student has a disability and the behavior that they're having was a manifestation of that disability. We have to be open to conversation. We have to be open to other alternatives. Sometimes we see this not only with manifestations like I was just talking about, but also in meetings where there's a change of placement being thought of and being recommended. If we come and we say, we've decided that this student has to go into a self-contained classroom for behavioral needs or a self-contained classroom for our academic life skills type of needs, then we have to come with that recommendation, but also be appropriately open to other suggestions and other ideas as they are put forth by other members of the committee, including the parent. Well, everybody gets 4 hours of homebound, so that's what we're going to give your student. Or what we do is for students with speech therapy, they get 2 30-minute sessions per week. It's okay for us to say things like, as a general rule, students with this disability, or as a general rule, students with these challenges get these services X, Y, or Z, and they get them for this amount of time, that sort of thing. That's okay to say, but if you come in and with a hard and fast, predetermined rule that says we have to do this because your child has this set of disabilities or this this IEP goal or that sort of thing. That's not okay and will get us into trouble. We have to remember that we provide a continuum of services for every student. Things like we don't do resource at this campus, or we only do inclusion. Those are dangerous statements as well. Policy can't drive services. Student need drives services is the be all and end all of that. Don't bring that kid back to school until he has medication, such as, I'll just make a leap of faith here, is probably Ritalin or Adderall or some other behavior modifying medicines where we see this said a lot. It's important for us to realize that parents have carte blanche when it comes to deciding what medication they put that child on, and most of the time, of course, that's done with consultation from a medical doctor. We don't have medical doctors in our meetings, and so we don't generally have the expertise sitting at that table to make recommendations about medication or health issues. We have to leave those to the parent and the doctor. Not to say that we can't give input, we can give lots of information, and we frequently do that, and we encourage the parent to share that with their doctor, or we get a release to share that with the doctor ourselves. But schools, we're not allowed to refuse services based on our child. The parents send their best child to us every morning, medicated or not, and we are under the obligation to educate that student as they show up at our doorstep. Does he have modifications in my classroom? Or accommodations, they're just a crutch. Or I only implement that accommodation when it's necessary. Of course, we hear this a lot from when we hear it. I shouldn't say we hear it a lot, but when we hear it from general education teachers. And we want to make sure that they understand, and everybody at that ARD committee understands, that accommodations and modifications were determined by a ARD committee to be appropriate and needed for a student, and that is a legal requirement now. We have to provide those for a student, even if we personally don't feel like they are necessary. If we don't feel they're necessary, then we should call an ARD and have the committee discuss that and revisit that issue and have our voices heard. So that's the end of our common things that we never want to hear or say or write down in an ARD meeting. If you have questions, talk to your diagnostician or your speech language therapist. They're your first line of defense there, as well as your LSSP. Of course, your special ed supervisors and myself and everybody else in the special ed department are happy to take any questions, answer your call, and help in any way we possibly can. Thanks, everybody.